Welcome back to day two. I hope you enjoyed yesterday. If you haven't seen me yet, I had the pleasure of hosting the first half of stage one yesterday. I'm Mark Fontijn, the host and founder of the Service Design Show. And I'm really honored to be back on the Service Design Network conference stage for the entire day. So I'll be starting off on stage one today with you, and then I'll move to stage two. Really excited. I see people already commenting in the chat, which is awesome. Say hello if you haven't done so already. I see people from Sweden, Thailand, Netherlands, Japan, all over the world. This is a really international community, and it's amazing to see that everybody's gathering here again for another day on taking a stand, because that's the theme of the conference. I have the honor, just like yesterday, to announce the first keynote of today. This is a speaker which I just recently learned about, did some research, did some background research, watched a few videos, read a few articles, and I must say I'm blown away. It's a super interesting topic. So we're going to welcome on stage, and I'm going to get my notes because I want to get this right. We're going to welcome on stage a futures researcher who's been on a 9-year nomadic journey exploring futures in over 90 countries. As a futurist and future designer, our keynote is a consultant and a prototypes culturally expansive, socially and environmentally engaged future world designs for media industry, technology companies, and cities and countries. Her name is Monika Bielskyte. Monika is also an internationally renowned public speaker on the field of innovation. And more recently, Monika has been working on Protopia Futures, a platform for research and creative collaborations, challenging and offering alternatives to dystopian and utopian stereotypes. Welcome to the stage, Monika.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all today. Let's hope we'll make it interesting as an opening for your second day.
I have the pleasure to do a Q&A session with you. So this won't be any slides. This will be just a chat between you and me and the rest of the community. I'll be monitoring the questions in the chat, but we had a preparation call yesterday and we managed to fill over an hour easily. So our 45 minutes will fly by. Monika, I hope I managed to give you a proper introduction, but is there something that I didn't mention that you feel should be part of your intro?
Yes, maybe a little bit. So I guess the world knows me as a futurist, because of the talks I've given and some of the things I've written, as well as different films that I worked on as a consultant, futurist consultant on. But I want to accentuate that really the foundation of all of my work really is futures research, right? So, what I'm trying to do is not invent magical, fictional ideas of my own about the future, but really go and put my body in the places where futures happens and continuously engage with people that I consider to be much smarter than me in any particular given discipline. And my role is very much to find the connections between these ideas, to synthesize and to extrapolate ultimately what could be the impact upon the humanity, right? So as much as I am science and technology nerd, the most important question I always ask is ultimately, what is the impact of it all on humanity and on the living world that we inhabit? Right. So research is really what it starts with. And I think we can just take it from there.
Yeah. So what I found fascinating while reading your articles is one of the things that stood out is that you mentioned there isn't a single future. There are multiple futures. Can you elaborate on that?
100%, 100%. So I think there's a popular assumption through maybe quite a lot of misguided futurist approach to say that this is the future. My bullshit filter, I hope I can use words like that, whether somebody, you know, is not a charlatan, is to look whether they say that there's only one way that things could be going. Now, there's certain limited cases, such as nuclear deterioration, or something like that is sort of very much predetermined where it's going in the future. But other than that, the best that we can do is really define a perimeter of possibility, within which certain things seem to be most likely based on our current understanding of science, technology, as well as humanities, so politics, social context, cultural context, et cetera, right? Certain things are slightly less likely, and certain things almost entirely improbable. And now within that perimeter, we might define certain scenarios that are the least desirable and the most desirable. Right? However, with every single day, with every single action of all of us, right? With every single scientific discovery, with every single sort of debunking of currently considered to be true theory, with every single political development, that perimeter slightly shifts. And sometimes it can shift even very significantly. Right? So there is never one future, only multiple futures. And I think it's very important to continue to engage with that possibility space and to realize how each of us are participating in that future making. And we do that with our individual actions, but we also do that within organizations, corporations, political bodies that we're part of. And I think that's fundamentally one of the most important questions for us to ask ourselves. How whatever that we do is creating the future that we either want or we fear to inhabit.
Mm. We've seen some great examples of hopeful futures yesterday in some of the presentations. Now, what has shaped our vision of the future? What have been the dominant forces that have been shaping our thinking about the future up till now?
Yeah, so as I often say, it's those who control the fantasy that control the future. I think we often have this misguided idea that it's these prominent tech billionaires, you know, the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks and the Sergey Brins of the world that define what future is or is not going to be, or certain most powerful political figures. However, and especially the case with technologists and scientists and technological and scientific bodies, most of the time, if we start unraveling and unpacking their personal history, we'll realize that at a certain point, these particular individuals picked up a book or watched a movie or TV series or played a game, and it really struck them. And especially it struck them while they were children or teenagers, so in very early days of their life. And then as they grow up, as they accumulate influence, wealth, power, et cetera, oftentimes they seem to be stuck on those ideas of when they were generally, unfortunately, little boys, right? Because it tends to be a lot of these little boys that tend to be stuck on a very particular science fiction fantasy. And so the mission that they set out on is to create something that somehow allows them to live that childhood fantasy / dream, etc. Right? And so in that way, what we realize is that imagination that we have of the future really matters. And it matters not only within the sort of academic context, within people that work in futures and foresight field, but it really matters, you know, from the day that we're little children, what kind of visions of the future we consume. Because what they can do is either open or limit our imaginations, right? And so ultimately, and we could speak about any specific cases, right? Science fiction, unfortunately, and hopefully in the future, if we do better science fiction, fortunately, bleeds in a certain way into reality. And so much of our effort as humanity, so much of the funds and some of our energy and talent ends up being funneled in certain things that oftentimes have been defined as futuristic through this lens of science fiction. And so many other things that actually are equally or possibly much more futuristic and much more future worthy and future urgent oftentimes do not get that attention.
So we have a pretty, we have or had a pretty limited perspective or imagination about the future, what it could be, and it has been shaped by a limited number of people. Most of those futures are quite binary. They're either the perfect world, quote unquote, where everything is green and we use high-speed trains, or it's either a very dark world, right? Those have been the two worlds that have been presented to us. Is there an alternative?
Well, we're trying to create that alternative with my project Protopia Futures. I would like to preface that with the fact that the work that we're creating is not something entirely new. You know, it's really built on the, you know, it's grown in a way in the soil. I wanted to say it's built on the shoulders of giants, but actually I'm changing that and saying that it's really grown in the soil nourished by our ancestors. You know, both physical ancestors and intellectual, creative, etc., spiritual ancestors. So, you know, what we are trying to do is to bring a lot of these ideas together to create an alternative to the binary of utopia and dystopia. Now, I think it's important to understand, well, why is this even necessary? You know, because a lot of times people will say, well, you know, actually the purpose of dystopia is to criticize and to imagine these most negative scenarios so that we could avoid them. And the purpose of utopia is to create these dreams so we could achieve them. Now, I think both of these ideas are very, very problematic. And I do not see utopia and dystopia as polar opposites, but rather as reverse sides of the same coin. Why is that so? So let me kind of dive a little bit into it. As many of us will recognize, right? Especially Hollywood science fiction, with the recent exception of maybe Black Panther, has been predominantly preoccupied with dystopian imagination, right? And those dystopias are very much the visions of the world where ultimately it's kind of like dancing on the deck of a Titanic. Nothing ultimately can be salvaged. You know, some kind of drama is happening within it, but there's very little hope given that a better world could come. And especially that it could come not through the magical actions of some particular superhero, but rather through the works of communities coming together, right? So what it does, dystopian, what I call dystopian fetishism, ultimately disengages us from the future action today. It makes us feel that ultimately whatever we do will not actually matter because the future is doom and gloom. But possibly there's something even worse that comes through that. In some cases, you know, initially I was really into this idea of Black Mirror because of how specific it was on particular uses of technology gone wrong or implementations of technology gone wrong. But ultimately what I realized with Black Mirror, as well as most notably with films like Minority Report, is that they become product roadmaps. So dystopia becomes a product roadmap for companies, you know, governments, and any kind of other entities that want to cash in on furthering the oppressive systems or inventing new oppressive systems that generally tend to perpetuate the past oppression. And so I think that's where there was a use of dystopia back in the 80s and possibly into the early 90s, especially through the work of phenomenal people like Octavia Butler. However, today, when so many of us, especially through this pandemic, are living dystopian reality, and so many peoples of the world, notably indigenous people, African peoples, have lived through dystopia historically. More than anything, it just becomes a means to enforce these harmful stereotypes and to disengage people from acting upon tangible futures. So one would say, well, utopia is then the answer, right? Utopia tends to be this very positive, very hopeful, very inspiring and inspired vision of the future. But generally, it seems to be so very much on the surface. So in general, even utopia, the word itself actually means no place. So there's this idea of unachievability. But there's something much more problematic with utopianism and utopian thinking, which in some way is connected to the foundations of futurism itself. So much of utopian thinking has been tied with eugenics. Now, I don't know how many of you know what eugenics is. It's a vision of, a better future through creating the sort of the superhumans, the superior humans that tended to be completely tied in with racism, ableism, queerphobia, and oftentimes resulted actually in very direct genocidal action. Right? So Nazi Germany was actually a utopia for the Nazis. It had a really compelling environmental vision, right? But it only required murdering 6 million Jews, and then on that also queer people and Roma people and any other marginalized communities that resisted the regime or were perceived as a threat to the regime. In South Africa, where I'm speaking from Johannesburg currently, apartheid system was utopia for the Afrikaners. Right? Price being paid by everybody one shade darker than white. And so many of the figureheads of utopian thinking have very concretely embraced eugenics and this idea of eliminating whoever was defined as weaker, lesser than, et cetera, et cetera. And so most of these visions and most of the utopian cities and utopian constructs have actually been built around almost exclusively able bodies, white bodies, male bodies, and excluded anybody else that tended to contradict that reality, right? So that is even perceptible today in so many of the visions of solar punk and hope punk, which are, I will agree, quite interesting genres, but so far on most of what I've seen, it imagines these environmental and sustainable and green visions of the future, but doesn't question at all, well, what is the historical legacy that we're building upon? How do we actually, to imagine a better future is to address the inequities of the past and create systems of justice rather than just leapfrog and say, well, somehow we'll manage to solve it, right? And let alone, it's not about the exclusion of queerness, disability, indigeneity. It's precisely about centering the leadership. So Protopia as a project, right, which is an alternative to both dystopian and utopian thinking, it is about centering the leadership and the justice related to queerness, disability, and indigeneity. And it's about recognizing that whenever we want to address any massive looming global problem, instead of asking the opinions of the most privileged, we have to address the concerns of people that will be most harmed by a particular technology, by a particular policy, by particular so-called innovation, by any type of whatever that we define as progress, which sometimes just is progress by the name. Right, so hopefully that addressed all of these matters of why utopia and dystopia are not polar opposites. They rather the reverse sides of the same coin. How, actually, a very important thing, an example from Minority Report, right? So Minority Report was surveillance state dystopian, film about surveillance state dystopia. However, because the technology within it was created to be so compelling, it ended up on the decks of so many of the Silicon Valley companies pitching for funding in augmented virtual mixed reality, without any analysis that maybe this is not what we want to do. maybe this is not the model we should follow. Maybe this is not the ideology that should be driving what we're trying to do. Currently we're also seeing that with all of the metaverse hype, and how, so many of these illustrations, notably by Facebook, is almost a direct facsimile of the vision of this book by Ernest Cline, Ready Player One, which is most definitely not what we should want for the metaverse, because exactly what it was a dystopia, and yet Facebook is pitching it right now as utopia.
Yeah. So a lot of to unpack here, and I think the message I'm getting is that we might feel that these are just stories. We are creating movies, we're writing books, but as you said, they become roadmaps for future development. And that's I think also an interesting call to the design community, as we have the opportunity and the power to shape future stories and think really carefully about which stories we tend to create and tend to shape. So if dystopia and utopia aren't the way to go forward, or at least we've seen what happens when those are the images of the future, and if we have an alternative in the form of Protopia, how can we take that and make that into actually tangible stories that do inspire a better future? How can we take this forward?
Yeah, so I think I love your question, and it relates to some of the conversations that we have had. I think very important is to step back and really analyze, right, why there is still that saying that this is just a movie, this is just a game, it doesn't really matter, why are you getting so serious about it, etc., etc. From a perspective of evolutionary biology, the way we are formed, the way our brains learn, the way we sort of assimilate information, it has always been through stories, right? Within the indigenous cultures, today, sometimes people from settler colonial cultural frameworks will look at indigenous dances, stories, music, performance, etc., and will perceive it as this sort of a decorative, very lovely, but essentially just a performative element of culture. Now it is everything but. Right? Within the indigenous storytelling, be it in the form of a ritual, be it in the form of music, be it in the form of a performance that is fully embodied, it is always about lessons, right? So within oral cultures, that's what encapsulates knowledge. So, any particular sort of storyline tells you, well, this is the way you solve your community's problems. This is the way you find the watering hole in a desert in a time of drought. This is the way, you feed in the harder times. This is the way, this is the time that you can hunt a particular animal and not at another time, right? And as humans, for millennia, in fact, tens, hundreds of thousands of years, we've evolved to understand the world through narratives. And so what we're seeing today, sort of the superhero movies and any kind of random science fiction, etc., it's not just entertainment. In fact, media is the modern day mythology. It maybe does not directly make us behave like that particular bad or good guy in a film, but it ultimately informs our values and perceptions of the world. So this is a very important thing to analyze and understand. And when we ask ourselves any particular question about the future, any particular question, who do we think is making or not making future happen? Where do we think future happens and where the future does not happen, right? What really shapes these things? What is attention worthy? We have to ask ourselves, are we biased because of the media that we have consumed? Are we being objective? And we are actually never objective. And so if we are biased, we need to start peeling off and unraveling this bias. So I think that's point number one regarding the question that you asked. And now how do we make it actionable? I think within every organization, within any individual practice, it's quite different. But the point is that we all have an audience, right? Some of us, or the works that we create, have audiences of ultimately billions of people. Some of us have audiences of hundreds of millions of people. Some of us have audiences of tens of millions, millions, thousands, and sometimes it's an audience of 5, right? Our most immediate family, right? Our younger sister, our younger brother. Sometimes it goes both ways, not just the parent has an influence over his child, but as a child, we have an influence over a parent. And so it really matters, what do we share with the world? And whatever we put on our social networks, whoever we choose to support, as a business or as a story, who do we allow to inform our worldviews? Is everybody that we read and follow and consider as our hero is an abled person? Is everybody, person of the same racial group? Especially if we generally have privileged, have been racially privileged, right? And we do not expand within that racial privilege in our reading lists and in our understanding of the world. I think sometimes it is a very hard thing to step out of one's comfort zone. And for example, as a racially privileged person, to hear about the experiences and immerse yourself in the knowledge of historical oppression that partially you have benefited from, of people that were considered to be lesser than your own group, right? Sometimes it's very hard as a cis hetero person to understand perspectives of queer activists and queer scholars, because we feel very challenged in our very fundamental values and very fundamental prisms upon the world. Sometimes it's incredibly hard, and that's something that I wanted to speak about later on, from a perspective of an abled person, be it physically or mentally or both. It is very hard for us to understand why perspectives of disability are so vital, not just to make the world a better place for people with disabilities, disabled people, but for everybody, right? And so I think fundamentally, these are the building blocks for me to realize how content actually matters, stories really matter, and we are telling stories every day. And then what are these stories that we're telling? We are only able to tell the stories that are within our horizons, right? So if we never stepped out of our own individual experience, these are the only stories that we'll be able to tell. When we start stepping out of our individual experiences, we will be challenged. We will realize sometimes how we have been complicit with historical or present-day violence. Sometimes we'll experience the feelings of shame, but it is a necessary step, and we should not look into it as a burden, as this heavy thing, as a heavy load, but rather like an opportunity to really expand our horizons and to learn and to be curious and to make our vision more complete. And that's where, oftentimes, even within science fiction, a word or like a terminology that I prefer so much more to world building is world growing, right? So world building is a lot of folks in the science fiction use that term when you imagine that futuristic world within an action of a particular sci-fi movie or TV series or an entire franchise happens where you build out that world. Now, I believe that the only way, and actually this concept of world building has bled even into very much of a down-to-earth practical practices of not just futurists, but also foresight practitioners, right? So foresight practitioners, I do that as well. It's very much being grounded in reality. And I find that the notion of world building is really quite unhelpful, because it still very much positions us in this perspective of the top down, right? It's like we exist on top of this world, and now we're going to build this better world on top of this particular city, on top of this particular reality, etc., etc. And so I much more prefer this idea of world growing, What does it mean to work with reality? What does it mean to recognize that some of the seeds, and sometimes not just the seeds, but even the seedlings are already here, but maybe we've been considering them as weeds, and we need to nourish them, and we need to fertilize them, and we need to make compost with the food that we've eaten and we've considered to be waste. And so I love this idea of world growing, be it, in very tangible foresight, futurist exercise within, corporate context, within community context, within, policy context, but also within science fiction, to see how do we resource ourselves in the reality of this lived world, in the knowledge, even technological knowledge of the living world. Instead of just trying to invent artificial intelligence systems from scratch and robotics from the scratch, we have the most intelligent systems on this planet, as living entities, and we can resource ourselves in that, but resource ourselves in an equitable manner, not just taking and taking and taking, right? But seeing how can we exist in reciprocal relationship with all the knowledge that's given to us.
So knowing this and hearing this, and I'm feeling that the community here is very open and eager and absolutely curious to learn and to explore and step into uncharted territory, do things that make them uncomfortable. One of the things might be sort of not being aware or not knowing about the fact that you may be excluding unintentionally groups of people. I'm curious, how could you, as a practitioner, build that awareness? How can you grow that awareness? How do you grow that awareness?
Yeah, so let me give you an example how, especially within science fiction, but then even within corporate exercises of futurism, we send these sometimes subconscious and sometimes very conscious messages. So an example is the movie Blade Runner 2049. Right? It portrays a future of a city that is a real city that is over 50% population of color currently in about 30 years' time. Now, all the projections are showing that population of color will increase in the city of Los Angeles. However, in that film, everybody, especially everybody in the position of power, is shown as a white person. Right? Even when we look into, funny thing that somebody recently pointed out, funny, actually really horrible thing, that somebody pointed out to me recently is how within also original Blade Runner, the highest grade, of the cyborgs were in fact sort of the most white, blonde, blue eyes, sort of Aryan looking, and what kind of message that sends when this is the highest grade of a cyborg, or in films like Ghost in a Shell, the American remake, when the original person who was killed was an Asian woman, and then she gets put into Scarlett Johansson's body and is being told how now she is made to be so perfect, right? So ultimately, what kind of message this type of science fiction sends? It sends a message, especially in the case of Blade Runner 2049, that, well, these people don't exist anymore. These people that we identified as the other don't exist anymore, right? So what happened? Did a genocide happen? Are they all incarcerated? Like, what is the story behind that? And these things unfortunately affect us. Now, I feel right now with a lot of sort of diversity and inclusion efforts within corporate setting, there's been a lot of tokenization. Right. And so we try to include people of different genders and different skin tones in our promotional videos, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the time, it is still so visible how that particular narrative, that particular idea of the future behavior, future attire has been written by a person that does not belong or doesn't have any intimate connection to any of these marginalized groups that are tokenized for the purpose of corporate promotion. Right. So I think this is a real kind of failure point, how, either sometimes almost malignantly, groups of people are being excluded, or sometimes through this idea of charitability, when we are designing for rather than designing truly with. When we say, oh, we're going to be designing this for the refugees, or we're going to be designing this for the poor, or we're going to be designing this for the disabled, right? We take that top-down approach and we fail from the start, because it is truly the communities that have been living with a particular problem, with a particular reality, with a particular challenge their entire lives, and oftentimes, the lives of their ancestors too, that will know a much better answer to that. So we can only do that by coming together. And I think, one of the most important cases really, and that I feel personally so passionate about, is the case of disability inclusion. How so much of both technological design and urban design, sees disability as this unfortunate thing that we have to adapt ourselves to. It's some kind of charity thing that we have to do, we're being forced to do, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, this attitude is completely false. So much of a technological innovation, architectural innovation, urban innovation that has made lives better for most of us has come from disability adaptation and has been led by disability innovators or disability justice activists that demanded for particular adjustments, right? And so it's everything from, how the sideways that a disabled person can ride on, young mothers can put their oh my God, baby carriages on.
Yeah.
Anybody carrying a heavy suitcase can do that. I mean, it has helped us in so many ways. Similar thing like subtitles, enlarging the things on our screen, and just countless, making things brighter, making things darker, some things that we take for granted that have improved health and well-being for all of us, initially was something that the designers looked down at because it was seen as only something for the disabled people. I mean, all of the actually voice assistants, initially that was adaptation for hard of seeing community, right? And now, audiobooks and such and such. This has become something that benefits us as a collective humanity. But even beyond that, what I want to insist upon is that disability, not just physical disability, but also mental disability and neurodiversity, within it contains a deep understanding that we are interdependent, that none of us can make it alone, that we are here to contribute and to care and to help each other. And it is that way that we become stronger together, right? Whereas ableism manifests in this idea that it's about individual success, it's about competition, it's about individual victory and such, right? Which is not at all a societal framework that we need right now as we're facing these global challenges. So, I mean, this is really something that I feel incredibly passionate about, and I continue seeing being disregarded, especially in the case of the COVID pandemic. Disabled people's rights have been put the very last in line, and it actually made the world more dangerous for all of us.
While listening to your story, for me, it sometimes feels like there is a huge burden on our shoulders to create a good future. And for lack of better word, I can imagine that at sometimes it's paralyzing, like, am I doing the right thing? Because there are so many things you could be missing. And you mentioned doing it with each other is already relieving some of that burden, but do you have some guidance? How do we actually define what is future worthy?
Yeah. So another little reframing. I loved your questions. Thank you so much for being so considerate and informed about my past work and research. So within settler colonial cultures, which unfortunately have become the dominant cultures of the world today, power, to be powerful, is considered to have the ability to exploit, to oppress, to take, to consume, right? Within the indigenous framework, power means responsibility. If you have power, that means you have obligations, right? And so humans with indigenous frameworks have been seen as custodian species. You know, we have responsibility to care and to nurture and interact with the living world. So a lot of the so-called wilderness areas, be it in North America and Australia, that you know, when the colonizers came and saw them for the first time, they considered them to be so wild and so lush and so beautiful. But in fact, yes, they were lush and beautiful, but they were not wild. They were actually in reciprocal relationship with custodian peoples, right? And so I think it's very important to start seeing ourselves as that, you know, not as, you know, a man rule upon his dominion, but as we are part of that ecosystem. We are entirely dependent on it. And so we must give back as much as we take. And now ecosystem is, yes, you know, us humans and the living world, but it's also us with each other. And so here, I think it's very important to rethink this idea of human-centered design towards life-centered design. You know, how are we centering life and aliveness within our designs? So I think that's kind of step number one. And then, you know, I think one of the most crucial points is to really see, again, how do we grow upon each other's effort? And how do we, whenever we have a question, you know, who should be the leader of this particular change? You know, it should not be the people that will be the greatest beneficiaries. It should be the people that possibly might be the worst harmed, right? And I think always reconsidering that and reconsidering, you know, how do we create a map of our ignorance? How do we identify all of these things that we don't know? Instead of being like, this is what I know, I'm going to be firm about it. How do we identify, well, where are these spaces that we still have growing to do? And how we also reconsider that being born into knowledge, you know, being born into access to knowledge is not the same, but it's a similar kind of privilege as being born to the access to material goods, right? And so all of us, ultimately, our education, our architectural planning in our cities, our economic systems, they have historically been racist, ableist, misogynist, queerphobic, anti-Indigenous, etc., etc. Right? So that's what we're all working on. That's what most of us have started with when we were born. Now we know that this is not working. So it's a task for all of us to see how each of us have different access, have different glimpse into a particular solution, and that we can come together so that we can be stronger as a group, and more than just the sum of our parts, but a multiplier to each other.
And I feel that it would inject a lot of humbleness and curiosity, and that relieves a lot of the weight and restrictions on our shoulders. I want to try to get into some of the questions from the people who are watching and listening. One of the types of questions that stands out is, it's obvious that you have a lot of background in this topic. You've done a lot of research, reading, following what has been going on, and you're sharing this with us. But for someone who's new into this way of thinking and is inspired by it, how could they become better? How can we practice our protopian sense making, our recognition for Protopia?
So what I've been really loving is to observe how a lot of authors that are in the realm of technological, social, racial, gender, etc. justice, sort of younger generation authors, especially women and other minority gender authors, in the recent books have been very generous with sharing what has informed their work, right? So when you pick up one book, all of a sudden, it's like this incredible Wikipedia entry. It gives you access to all of this other research and to all of these other people, working on a particular thing. So for example, a recent book by Sasha Constanza-Chock, Design Justice, right? It refers to so many folks that are working in a certain adjacent areas of that particular thing. And, I've been trying to do that myself as well. I, on every of my social media, be it LinkedIn. In fact, I've been meaning to start a book club on LinkedIn as well, because for now I've been doing it on Twitter and Instagram. But I continuously share, what informs my own research, what are the books that I'm reading, who are the scholars to follow, and Protopia Futures, so at Protopia Futures, sort of our channel, be it on Twitter or on Instagram. What we're trying to do is really share as many resources as possible. So instead of being sort of stingy that this is the information that we have access to, these are the conversations that we are having, and we want to keep them for ourselves. On the contrary, what we're trying to do is share this process of learning. And so I think it really has to start about that. We have to learn, we have to step out of our comfort zone. And then as we learn and understand more, we have to sort of start questioning very tangibly how any particular thing that we're doing within any particular industry that we're working, within any particular social life that we're engaging, in the private part of sort of our existence, how these things participate or in a way deny certain values or interests or goals that we seem to espouse. So I think, again, even just as it is in my work, any kind of beautiful output, such as, for example, this particular project with digital artist Mario Mimosa behind my back, I'm using it as a background, or any collaborations that I have with filmmakers, digital artists, animators, illustrators, etc., in a way, they are just consequences. They are just the results of us coming together and learning together and exchanging with each other what we know and what we don't know. And it's a very tricky one as well right now, because interestingly enough, during pandemic, that kind of group exchange has been precipitated a lot, but oftentimes it has actually helped the spread of disinformation, right? So this person sent me this thing on the WhatsApp, now I'm going to be forwarding it to 100 of my friends. And then the next thing you know, you're spreading ableist, racist, transphobic, etc. disinformation that was designed to separate, to alienate, and to induce hatred. Right. So I think it's this very delicate balance. Yes, we want to share information. And yes, that we don't want to be hierarchical. At the same time, we need to be attentive of the values and credentials, not just academic credentials, but also community and policy credentials of people whose worldviews we allow to influence ours. So it's a delicate dance, but I think, it's so urgent and it's so exciting to be in this incredible position of being able to learn and to try and do better with however little time in the day that we have, right? Because not all of us are as privileged as to give our entire life to being curious, right? But let's try and bring whatever free time that we have in our daily lives, let's try and bring it to curiosity and expanding our horizons.
And as you mentioned, a book could be sort of a great Wikipedia entry. And I think for today, you're a great Wikipedia entry. There are two more questions that I think are super interesting. So maybe we can squeeze them in the time we have left. One question relates to metrics for evaluating the work of design in a system that only values time and money. And this, I think, relates to the previous question we had about who defines the future, or what is future worthy. Could you briefly comment on what you think are sort of criteria for success, or how do you evaluate success? How do you know, how could you know that you're going in the right direction? What it is, right?
Yeah, actually, I realized now that you're asking me that, I realized that I forgot to fully answer your previous question of what is and is not future worthy. So I'll try to be very brief. But one of the things that I've been really noticing over the last few years is how pervasive Judeo-Christian bias is in what we consider to be or not to be future worthy. So let me be more specific. Right, within Judeo-Christian religious frameworks, body, is sinful. Earthly existence in some way is tied to the evil, and the life, the creation, the ever after exists in the heavens. Right, the God is in the heavens, the God is above. And I've been seeing so much how so many things that are transpiring in our culture, notably this very dangerous, fairly new philosophical strand of futurism called long-termism, which sort of evaluates human potential. It's not long-termism, is not long-term thinking. It's really sort of about, Phil Torres writes really interestingly about it, and we're working on co-writing several pieces together, is this idea that we can disregard present day harm that is being created, even genocidal harm, as long as it creates a brighter future for humanity, which ultimately is going into the stars and colonizing, other planets and other solar systems, which ultimately it really is just a metaphor for heavens, right? And I think it's a very misguided notion. I mean, I don't say let's not look at the stars, let's not try to understand the universe. I'm absolutely pro fundamental science, but in terms of where our future is at, this idea that our future is in the heavens, our future is in transcending our physical bodies and uploading our minds to the matrix, et cetera, it's very much a continuation of that binary of heaven and hell, original sin, and transcending our bodies rather than our bodies being vehicles for transcendence. And so what I think is much more future worthy than we've been paying attention to is really what is below, which has been in most of the indigenous understandings of the world, right? So it is the soil, it's the health of our soil. It's all these living creatures that are not the huge predators, the lions and whatever, as much as, of course, we love the lions, but it's also the fungi, it's the bacteria, it's the viruses, it's the insects, it's all of the ecosystems of the soil, of our oceans, of our rivers and our lakes. Right? It's all of these much more earthly, less sort of superficially grand things, but it's really what nourishes us and that we are completely interconnected with through the health of our microbiome. So I think that's the most important thing that I want to rephrase, is that for me, it's much more futuristic today to work on the health of our soils and our oceans and our ecosystems, not just on a planetary scale, but also on our human body scale, then sending rockets up to colonize, which is again a traditional colonial framework, Mars, right? So that's an important answer to the previous question. Now to this question that you said, how do we judge the success of a particular thing? I mean, today we still live in a capitalist system. Capitalism is predicated on the infinite growth in the finite world. And I used to say in the world of finite resources, but this is not a world of finite resources. If we identify our planet simply as resources to plunder, we already are stepping on a wrong foot, right? So, it's capitalism, it's this idea of infinite growth in the finite world. And it doesn't work that way. At the very least, if we are trying to stick to the material growth based on production of more material goods. So what we can imagine is actually infinite growth when it comes to knowledge, right? When it comes to understanding and economies around that. Now, of course, we have to get much better, in terms of data storage, et cetera, the interesting avenues opening up within data storage within the DNA and things like that. But what's important is to start considering, well, what does the post-growth world looks like? And how we design for the world that is not as much about expanding, but actually about thriving, about being healthy, right? So what does that look like? And how do we participate in that? And for me, the most interesting thing right now is, especially with my line of work, right? Foresight, futurism, as well as science fiction, world design. It's really, is what I'm creating opening up new opportunities? Is it expanding people's minds? Is it making us feel like we're expanding our potential? Intellectually and physically, yes, but also creatively and emotionally. Is it also opening doors so that others could walk through them? Because some of these challenges seem to be unsurmountable, and we're seeing that the change, especially for the more elderly among us, might not even happen within our lifetime. But we're not just living for ourselves. Again, within Indigenous frameworks, our lives, how we live our lives gives the meaning of the generations that come prior to us, because they created that soil in which we have grown. And so we give meaning to the lives of our ancestors, and we set the foundation for the generations to come after us. And we live in this continuous cycle, so we never apart. And so I think it's really, how do we judge whether something is successful? Well, it has to resonate with people, and it has to create sort of a good invention, creates opportunities for us to invent more. And it opens new doors so that not just us, not just our own group, not just our own community, but many more of us could walk through them. And so in that effort, I believe that intersectionality is absolutely key. So it's never just about one particular issue. It's not just about environmental justice. It's not just about disability justice. It's not just about racial justice. It's about seeing how all of these things intersect and ultimately make the world a kinder and a more compassionate place for all of us, human and also non-human.
It would be almost a great point to end, but I want to ask you one final question before we say goodbye, and that is, you mentioned we all have an audience. In this case, you have an audience of people who are open and curious and waiting to be inspired. If you would have one call to action to end this conversation with, what kind of call to action would you like to give us?
I think the most important thing is to realize that future is not just shaped by our actions, but also by our inactions. So whenever we choose to say that, well, this is not my fight, this does not concern me, this is happening somewhere else to somebody else, this is not going to come after me, ultimately it does. And I think this pandemic and the ableism pervasive through this pandemic has been a perfect illustration of that. So many people said, oh, but me, I'm healthy, I'm strong, like this does not concern me. And then when they got sick and they ended up in a hospital and they realized that they had this latent cancerous growth, or they had this other health issue they were not aware of, or this happened not to them, but to their parent or to their loved one or to their child. you sort of realize, well, none of us is actually, none of us will ever be able forever. At any given moment, ourselves or anybody we love could become disabled. And so if we disregard what happens to people that we don't identify as strong and healthy and whatever, we ultimately put ourselves in that same position. And that goes also when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, when it comes to queerness and things like that, right? Queerphobia, homophobia, transphobia ultimately limits all of us in how we're able to express our gender, our culture, our sexuality, etc., etc. It corners all of us into this cartoon caricatures trying to play out a particular norm that is dominant in this moment in time, that is by no means have been universal, right? So I think it's really about that. It's not just what you do, it's also what you don't do. Whenever you think, well, this is not my problem, this does not concern me, my family, my community, it happens to them, right? That's when it ultimately ends up happening to you. And so we need to start seeing ourselves as interconnected, and we need to start seeing how with whatever that we do, every small action, it's not perfect, but we must try and just do a little bit more each day for each other.
And on that note, do a little bit more each day for each other. I think that's a great wrap up of the almost last 50 minutes. Monika, thank you so much for coming on our virtual stage, sharing this with us, inspiring us, giving us hope, giving us a different perspective on what the futures might be. All the relevant links will be included with your presentation, so that people who are inspired can walk through the door and learn more about this. So once again, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you so much. And I keep sharing the resources and point towards amazing work that so many people that are more brilliant than me are doing across all of the fields that I've been trying to immerse myself and understand.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye. And now, after this inspiring talk, it's my turn to move you into the next section of the conference. And I see a lot of hand clapping. Let me refresh my memory and look at the schedule. So if I'm not mistaken and the schedule is still correct, we're heading for a break until for the next 23 minutes. Yes, and I'll, after the break, be moving to stage 2. So you're watching stage 1 right now. If you're still here, you can stick around here. There are going to be some really cool talks. And on stage 2, I'll share some other talks. I think it's time to network. It's time to grab a fresh drink. It's time to process this amazing chat with Monika. Be back in 22 minutes, either on stage 1 here, or join me on stage 2, where I'll be your host for the next few sessions. See you in a minute.